Okay, let's unpack this. Picture the scene. A pastor, maybe somewhere in the global south, feeling this immense pressure,
Hmm.
to measure their church's success by, well, things you can count. Turnover, salaries, media presence, big impressive
Right,
buildings.
the externals. Very visible stuff.
Exactly. And then you've got another pastor just trying to serve their community, maybe wondering, do I really need to spend money we barely have on this flashy conference? Or buy that latest success book?
It's a real tension. And it really makes you question what we mean by success, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. What is the real measure, whether we're talking about a church or, frankly, any project, even our own lives?
That's really the heart of what we want to explore today.
Ah,
Because in a world that loves metrics and, let's be honest, external validation, figuring out what truly matters can be tough.
yeah.
That pressure you described, that feeling of needing to fit into a certain, maybe materialistic definition of success, I bet many of you listening feel that in your own fields too.
Oh, for sure. We're constantly bombarded with messages about what making it looks like.
Exactly.
So for this deep dive, we thought, let's go straight to a foundational source. Let's see how it tackles this very question, specifically for the church.
Makes sense. Where are we headed?
We're diving into Matthew's gospel. We'll focus particularly on Jesus' teachings about discipleship, especially around chapter 16, and then look at the big finale, the Great Commission, in chapter 28.
The Great Commission, right at the end.
Right. Our mission today is basically to understand what Jesus seemed to view as the mark of a successful movement. And we'll lean on some scholarly insights, particularly those highlighting Matthew's focus on discipleship as, like, the core purpose of the church.
It's a fascinating approach. I know some scholars, like Edgar Krentz, have suggested reading Matthew almost backward, starting from the end.
Backward. How so?
Well, the idea is that the conclusion often reveals the central theme, the main point of the whole narrative. And if you do that with Matthew, you land squarely on the Great Commission, Matthew 28, verses 16 to 20.
Okay, I see. So the ending kind of illuminates everything that came before.
Precisely. And when you look closely at those verses, the first thing that really jumps out is who Jesus is talking to and what he tells them to do.
Right. It's not just the apostles, is it? It says disciples.
Exactly. He sends out disciples with the task to make disciples. It's this idea of replication, followers creating more followers.
It's a ripple effect.
Yeah. And picture the scene. They're in Galilee, where Jesus specifically told them to go after the resurrection. But Matthew doesn't paint this as just a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph.
No, it seems quite mixed, actually. You get a sense of complex emotions.
Totally. Matthew is very honest about the human element. Earlier, in verse 4, the guards at the tomb were so terrified they basically fainted.
Right.
The women who first saw the risen Jesus, they were afraid too, even mixed with joy. And then, the key line in verse 17, when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted.
Some doubted, even then, after everything.
Even then. And remember, there were only 11 of the core group left. This includes people who had, recently denied him or betrayed him.
Wow. That's actually kind of encouraging, isn't it?
How so?
Well, if these people, the ones who were right there, still had doubts and fears, and they were the ones given this huge mission, it makes it feel less like you have to be perfect to be part of it.
That's a great point. And many think that's precisely Matthew's intention here. The Great Commission isn't just for the spiritual superstars. It's for people who confess Jesus, yes, but who still wrestle with faith crises, with uncertainty.
Okay, so these doubting, imperfect disciples are gathered. Then what happens?
Then comes this huge declaration from Jesus in verse 18. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me.
That's quite a statement, not exactly subtle.
Not at all. It's a declaration of absolute authority, total power. And that's the foundation upon which he gives the command. It's like saying, because I have all authority, therefore.
Therefore, what's the actual command they're given?
The core instruction is right there in verses 19 and 20. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you.
Okay. Make disciples. That sounds like the main event.
It really is. Scholars point out that make disciples is the primary verb, the central action. The going, baptizing, and teaching are all part of how you make disciples.
So what is a disciple, according to this passage?
Well, based on the text, someone like R.T. France would define a disciple simply as someone who is baptized and, crucially, someone whose responsibility is to observe or obey everything Jesus commanded.
Baptized and obedient to his teachings. Okay.
Right. So if you put it together, the going, baptizing, and teaching are the key activities for the church. but they all serve that ultimate goal, making disciples.
Which, in Matthew's view, is the plan for establishing the church itself.
Exactly. This is the blueprint. The aim isn't just conversions, it's winning people to the status of true Christians, characterized by obedience. And that leads to the church being established in all nations with, meaningful success.
Meaningful success, not just numbers in a ledger or impressive buildings.
Precisely. Which brings up an interesting concept from the scholar Ulrich Ruiz, this idea of transparency.
Transparency, what does that mean here?
Ruiz suggests that the real measure of success is when disciples become essentially transparent models of what it means to be Christian. Their lives should clearly reflect Jesus' teachings.
So your life itself becomes the evidence, the clearest picture of what following Jesus looks like.
That's the idea. Your life becomes the compelling demonstration.
Okay, that gives us a strong sense of the end goal from Matthew 28. Now, you mentioned rewinding to chapter 16. What happens there?
Right, so Matthew 16 marks a significant shift. Jesus starts to focus his teaching much more explicitly on the nature of the church and what discipleship truly entails. It's seen as a real turning point.
A turning point. And this is where the word church itself appears.
Yes, for the first time in Matthew's gospel, Jesus uses the Greek word ecclesia, which we translate as church. It shows up in verse 18 and then again later in chapter 18.
Now, that word had a history, right, from the Old Testament.
It did. It often referred to the assembly of God's people, Israel. But Jesus seems to be giving it a new, broader meaning here, when it definitely includes Gentiles, non-Jewish people, alongside Jewish believers.
And scholars point out that Matthew's original audience, living in places where there were both synagogues and these new Christian communities, would have understood ecclesia as something distinct, right? Composed of both Jews and Gentiles.
Absolutely. There's what some call a Gentile bias, or at least a strong emphasis on Gentile inclusion throughout Matthew's gospel. And it's probably significant that this pivotal teaching happens in Caesarea Philippi.
Why Caesarea Philippi?
Well, it was a predominantly Gentile city.
Yeah.
So Jesus is making this foundational statement about his church in a very non-Jewish context. It underlines the universality of it.
That fits with other things in Matthew too, doesn't it? Like Jesus living in Capernaum, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy about Galilee of the Gentiles.
Exactly. Or think about the Roman centurion in chapter 8.
Ah, yes, the one whose faith, Jesus says, is greater than any he'd found in Israel.
Right. It all points towards this breaking down of ethnic barriers within this new community Jesus is building.
So in this Gentile setting, Jesus poses these absolutely crucial questions. First, who do people say the Son of Man is? Kind of testing the water.
Yeah, getting the popular opinion out there. But then he gets personal. But who do you say I am? Direct. Pointed.
And that leads to Peter's famous declaration in verse 16.
You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This confession is everything. It's the rock-solid foundation upon which Jesus then makes his proclamation about the church.
It's been called a Christological synthesis, right? Meaning Peter wasn't just saying Jesus was the Messiah or the Son of God, but somehow both, combining those roles.
Precisely. Peter grasps, perhaps not fully yet, but significantly, the unique identity of Jesus, both the promised Messiah King and the divine Son. It's this understanding that unlocks the next stage of Jesus' teaching.
Which is his statement in verse 18. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it.
Such a powerful image. Let's break that down a bit.
Okay, first, my church. It belongs to Jesus, and it seems universal, not just a local group.
Yes, it's his initiative, his community, and then that incredible promise. The gates of Hades, or gates of hell, basically the power of death and evil.
Yeah.
They won't win. They won't prevail against his church.
So the church is inherently, designed for victory.
In a sense, yes. Its success is guaranteed because it's built on Christ, who conquered death itself through his resurrection. Thinkers like A.T. Robertson pointed out that Christ's resurrection ensures the church's ultimate survival.
And its purpose, then, is tied to this victory.
Right. It's meant to actively struggle against those gates of Hades, to be the force that, through Christ's sacrifice, helps free people who are captive to sin and evil.
Wow. So it's a universal call, Jews and Gentiles alike, invited into this victorious community. Someone even described this moment as initiating the most important human right, the right to hear the gospel in your own context.
That's a powerful way to put it. It underlines the inclusivity. Then Jesus turns to Peter again in verse 19, mentioning the keys of the kingdom.
Ah, the keys. That's a passage that sparked a lot of debate over the centuries. How do scholars tend to approach that now?
Well, there are different perspectives. R.T. France, for instance, offers a balanced view. He suggests that while Peter clearly has a foundational role, the authority symbolized by the keys wasn't exclusively his forever. It was exercised on behalf of the whole community.
So not making Peter the sole gatekeeper, but perhaps the first one to use the key, representing the others.
Something like that. It contrasts a bit with views like John P. Myers, who might see Peter more as a kind of supreme rabbi figure for the church.
Yeah.
But maybe a helpful summary comes from Donald Sr., who sees Peter here primarily as a symbol of the developing pastoral leadership within the church.
So regardless of the precise nature of Peter's individual authority, the underlying message is about opening the doors.
Yes. Interpreted broadly, it's a call for all Christians, following Peter's lead, to actively participate in opening the way for everyone to enter the church, the kingdom community.
And we do see Peter taking the lead in the book of Acts, don't we? At Pentecost with Cornelius.
Absolutely. Acts 2, Acts 10, Acts 15, Peter's prominent. But crucially, the mission itself, the actual work of making disciples, is carried out by the whole community. It reinforces that discipleship making is for every Christian, not just designated leaders.
And this discipleship, Luz points out, is always tied back to the actual teachings of the historical Jesus, right?
Yes, that connection is vital. It's not just about belonging. It's about learning and obeying what Jesus commanded.
Which brings us to maybe the most challenging part of this passage in Matthew 16.
The call for personal transformation.
Exactly, because let's be honest, there's a bit of an identity crisis today around what discipleship even means.
That's true. Dallas Willard observed that it's entirely possible in many contexts to be considered a Christian without really being a disciple in the way Jesus describes.
Right, and sometimes, as Peter Wagner noted, the word disciple just gets used as a synonym for church member, losing its radical edge.
It definitely loses the sense of cost that someone like Bonhoeffer emphasized so strongly.
Which Jesus himself addresses head-on in Matthew 16, verse 24.
If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.
That doesn't sound like just joining a club. It sounds intense.
It is. This isn't just a program suggestion. It's a fundamental, radical call for a complete reorientation of life. It's about transformation.
Okay, so let's break that down. What does it mean practically? Deny himself.
It means dying to self-rule. Putting aside your own agenda, your feelings, your thoughts, your desires when they conflict with God's will. It's about submitting fully to Jesus' lordship. Philippians 2.3 touches on this, considering others better than yourselves.
It's about dethroning self.
Exactly. Davies and Allison talk about it as breaking every link to oneself, a total surrender. Jesus connects it elsewhere, like in Matthew 10, to loving him supremely, even above family.
Wow. Okay, what about take up their cross? That sounds ominous.
Well, while it gains an even deeper layer of meaning after Jesus' own crucifixion, even in this context, it points to radical obedience and readiness to suffer for following him. Luke's version adds daily, take up the cross daily.
So it's not a one-time thing, but a continuous posture.
Yes, it's about consistently choosing obedience, doing what the master wants, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something. As D.A. Carson notes, the cross imagery definitely becomes amplified after Golgotha, but the core idea of costly obedience was there from the start.
And the final part, follow me.
This is the commitment of your whole life to Jesus' will, wherever it leads. It's not just intellectual agreement, it's a concrete decision, as Bosch says, to follow him and submit your life trajectory to God's purposes. Meyer even sees Peter as the model disciple here, following Jesus ultimately to his own cross.
So bringing it all together, if we take Matthew's gospel, especially these key passages, as our guide,
then the measure of success for the church isn't found in those worldly metrics we started with, the buildings, the budgets, the media hits.
Right. It seems much deeper, much more internal, yet also active.
Exactly. It's rooted firmly in discipleship. Success is measured by the ongoing transformation of church members into genuinely committed, obedient Christians.
Who are then actively engaged in making more disciples, replicating that process of transformation.
That seemed to be the heart of it, according to Matthew.
It really does reframe the whole conversation about what success looks like, doesn't it? It shifts the focus dramatically.
It does.
And this isn't just a theoretical exercise for churches. As you're listening to this, maybe take a second to think about your own life, your work, your community involvement. How do you define success?
Yeah, that's a good challenge. Are you primarily focused on those external achievements, the things others can easily see and measure? Or are you also valuing, perhaps even prioritizing, your own internal growth, your character development, and the tangible, positive impact you're having on the people around you?
It really pushes you to consider what matters most.
And it leads to a final thought, maybe something to chew on after this deep dive.
Okay, leave us with something provocative.
Well, if this core mission, this definition of success, really boils down to making disciples people who embody and live out Jesus' teachings, leading to transformation, how might embracing that fully shift our priorities?
Hmm.
How might it fundamentally change our understanding of what's truly important, what really matters in the long run? Not just within a faith context, if that applies to you, but in our broader lives, our work, our communities. What would change if that became the central measure?